Well, let's talk now to Matthew Saltmarsh, who's from the United Nations Refugee Agency. Matthew, this is a sorrowful and long list. Which regions should we be most concerned about? Which are most critical?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, the numbers are very high, the numbers are at records, and the numbers are still rising, which is sobering and depressing. Which regions are the most acute? Well, I think you really have to look around the world, and there are very few regions that are untouched here. But, of course, you know, in the last year or so, the situation in Sudan has been particularly preoccupying. Over 10 million people displaced from Sudan, a bitter conflict that is causing huge bloodshed, instability, displacement, particularly in Darfur, but also across the borders around that region. But it's not just in Sudan. I mean, if you look to Ukraine, the war is still rumbling on there. You are seeing some fresh displacement of Ukrainians away from the front line and some movement within the country. But also there are, as you mentioned, long-standing, what we call protracted conflicts. Now, these sometimes blow hot and cold, but the instability and the lack of security in many of these places means that it is difficult, if not impossible, for people to return home sustainably. And we're thinking of places like, in particular, of the Afghans who have been displaced in Pakistan and in Iran and in Latin America. You could look at places like Venezuela. And then going to Asia, you can look at the situation in Myanmar. So really, across the globe, we have situations which are causing displacement, and we have a precious few solutions to them coming to the fore.
Refugees are too often dependent on the kindness of strangers. I wonder how you'd assess the level of international attention and assistance.
Well, it's been worryingly thin, to be honest. If we go back a couple of years after the Ukraine war broke out, there was an outpouring of goodwill and aid as well towards those who are displaced. We at UNHCR got a record level of donations from the private sector for that conflict. Now, however, that war has gone out of the headlines. The Sudan war has always struggled to get into the headlines. And when you look at our levels of funding in some of these situations, both in Ukraine and in Sudan, it's hovering around the 20% mark. And that means we simply don't have enough money, we simply don't have enough resources to be able to do what we desperately need to do to be able to help those people who have been so badly affected by these conflicts. But it's not just those. If you look all around the world, Africa, as I said, Latin America, into Asia, we are struggling to get enough funding to be able to provide the cash-based assistance, to be able to provide the shelter, the medical support, the food, the real basics that those who are displaced need.
Many of these people head to Europe in search of hope. Some very disturbing reports in Europe suggesting some displaced people are even thrown overboard to their deaths or pushed back into the sea. What's the UN's response on this?
Well, those reports are extremely worrying and extremely disturbing and very serious. We have, for a long time, been raising the alarm about pushbacks from Europe. Greece is one country. It's not the only one, but there have been a number of incidents reported from Greece. We've been collating that data and forwarding it to the authorities for official investigations. We think it's important that those investigations are independent and that they now make progress because, as you mentioned, the most recent reports are particularly worrying in that regard.
The latest EU election results demonstrate Europe leaning increasingly towards the right. How concerned are you about the growing anti-immigration and anti-migrant agenda?
Well, the right wing, the populists, have been scapegoating refugees and migrants. They have been blaming them for many of the ills in society, whether that's economic ills or other instability. Obviously, we think that's greatly exaggerated and very unfair. At the moment, as you said, the EU does seem to have shifted right. However, the EU does have a migration and asylum agreement, a compact, whereby the different states have agreed to what could potentially be a better management of new arrivals. So we're ready to support the EU with that, and we'll continue doing so.
Matthew, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Matthew Saltmarsh from the United Nations Refugee Agency.